Hi, I'm James from Chaosium. I sat down with David Larkins and we talked about playing your character's children or their adopted children or people they've influenced or people they've mentored, or in general, the broader concept of lineage play. It's something that's important in Pendragon as well as a ton of other games, and I wanted to hear David's take on it. I started off the interview by asking David to say exactly what lineage play is and to explain why it's cool. I'll jump across to that interview in just a moment, but first, remember to subscribe to the Chaosium YouTube channel, and thanks for watching.
Leading question, but one I'm happy to lean into because I do think it is very cool, and it offers a gaming experience that, like you say, is not really that common, but I think everyone should give a try at some point. So, you can define lineage play pretty simply, which is you start off with your standard group of player characters, whatever they may be, and eventually at some point you end up playing the offspring of those characters, whether these are biological offspring or adopted, or just legacy characters of some type or variety. I'm keeping it very broad here. The sort of default, the standard is obviously to play the biological offspring. So what makes that cool? Where do I even start? I mean, you get a baked in background that all the players instinctively understand, because they've lived it. You have the sort of fun and interesting experience of seeing how this new generation measures up to the generation preceding it. It's the Star Wars model, right? It's like these multiple generations of Skywalkers and their friends.
What kind of stories or adventures are told better through lineage play? What do they allow you to do that a normal game doesn't as much?
I think the best way to sum that up is depth. They give you a lot of depth. Even in a normal standard campaign framework, you might have recurring villains. Well, imagine if you have a recurring villain who shows up 25 years later, right? Call of Cthulhu is not generally thought of as a game that encourages long-term lineage play, but that's also kind of a trope in horror, isn't it? The evil returning. So if you're playing like the grandchildren of these investigators from the 1920s or 30s, who are then having to deal with the same evil, the players are going to immediately get freaked out because they're like, oh no, not again, and but at the same time, it just raises the stakes.
I'd like to ask a little bit about some of the systems and games that explore lineage play. Can you tell us a bit about them?
Lineage play, I mean, you can really do it with any game system. I think RuneQuest sets that up to a certain extent, right? Because you're rolling up your characters' backgrounds, and there's nothing stopping an ambitious GM from sort of starting a little earlier than what the timeline assumes, and playing up through into at least a couple generations. I think just basically any system where you are dealing with passage of time occurring relatively rapidly. So if you're playing any game where it's like one adventure just immediately leads into the next to the next to the next, and you've been playing for a year and only like 3 months of game time have passed by, then you're not going to get lineage play. You could do lineage play with D&D. You're going to have to come up with some house rules, in terms of like, hey, are there any special rules for rolling up, my character's offspring here, like in terms of like inheriting certain traits or aspects of the parent? But yeah, it's actually, it's more of like a concept than a mechanic, really.
I know we're set up for this, but I want to ask about Pendragon, because obviously Pendragon is a system that uses a lot of lineage play. Can you talk about lineage play and its role in Pendragon?
Sure. I mean, yeah, that's the elephant in the room. It's Pendragon, and I think even folks who are only passingly familiar with the game have probably heard that that's an aspect of play. It's not necessary to play the game, but it is sort of set up in a way that your characters are going to age relatively rapidly because you're playing one adventure, one scenario per game year. And if you're running like, if you're getting close to an average of one game session per scenario, that means every passing week, you're playing weekly, your characters are aging up a whole year, so it is set up to encourage that kind of long-term thinking. Don't think of yourselves as playing like individual characters. Think of yourselves as playing members of a household. Like, each knight's lineage is like a household, kind of taking a broader view on, so the actions of the individual characters are all feeding back into like how that house, how that lineage is going to be seen in the game world. It creates this whole extra layer.
So this kind of sounds like, in addition to building a character who has an arc and maybe explores a theme, you can actually have, your family explore a theme, like different aspects of honor, obviously for Pendragon, or, warfare, or, protection. You can have all these different characters that explore different aspects of the central concept. Is that one of the big benefits?
Yes, absolutely. And in Pendragon, there are actually mechanics for offspring. Like you might have someone who has a very high passion of any kind. Maybe it's honor, maybe it's a hate passion. There's generational hatreds, right, that get passed down, rivalries, that kind of thing, where the offspring character would then probably start with that passion. Or if you have two parents from like two different cultures, you would decide which of those two cultures your offspring character is most closely emulating as they're growing up. And that's maybe based on how they're being raised, or it's maybe just based on player preference, like, oh, it takes after the mother kind of thing, All of that in aggregate together, if you're following that train, okay, and you have these passions that are getting passed down from generation to generation, then yeah, you're just going to have an outcome where it's like, oh, this house is known for its bitter rivalry with this other house, or this house is known for producing chivalrous knights. It's just that, everyone from this particular lineage seems to be, cut out for the life of a chivalrous knight.
So let me turn this interview into some more direct advice for players and for GMs. As a GM, if I have a game or a setting or a scenario, I guess a campaign, not a scenario by definition, that is going to include lineage play, what are some things that I can do to bring the best elements of that kind of play style forward?
The most important thing, and this also applies to players, but especially for GMs, I mean, you should be taking notes regardless if you're running a campaign, but take very careful notes, right? And go back and review them. If you can, like, I don't know, record your sessions, not necessarily for distribution, just for your own use. Record your sessions, go back and re-listen to them months later, and maybe, take some notes like, oh, right, I forgot about this thing. What makes lineage play so much fun is when you can bring something forward that happened years and years ago, possibly to another character, possibly in another generation of characters, and bring it back and drop it right into the narrative. I guarantee you your players will remember it and love you for it.
What about advice that is very player specific? What can players do?
Yeah, so what players can do is understand what they're buying into. Okay, like for example, I've definitely known players in my time who get very invested in like the one character, like the first character they're playing in the campaign. And then when that character's time is up, so like in Pendragon, you start aging, and eventually you either die in combat, or you die of old age, or you just retire your character and then go off. When that character is out of the timeline, out of the main action, I've seen players lose interest, right? Because they're like, oh, I'm so invested in this character, right? So it's really important to kind of just get into the spirit of lineage play, which means that, it should be something that gets discussed at the top of the campaign too, right? The GM shouldn't just, assume everyone's going to be on board with this. Obviously any lineage play campaign by definition is going to take a while, so I would think you'd be talking about it. Definitely just honor what you're trying to do and approach each new character as a new experience to have fun with. And like for myself, it's as much about how is this character going to differ from their parent as how are they going to be similar, and then exploring the kind of conflicts that arise from that.
What about common pitfalls? Are there any mistakes that you've made as a player and creator in this space that you can give us the benefit of your experience so that we can avoid them?
Well, I mean, I was sort of, yeah, talking from negative experience there with the advice to players and GMs, because I'll tell you, you know, one of the worst feelings you can have if you're running a long-term Lineage play campaign is to realize you had a missed opportunity, you know, of some kind, you know, several years back or whatever, you know, like, oh, it would have been really cool if I'd brought in this guy or whatever. The other pitfall, and I'll once again reference Star Wars, is you want to be careful not to get too repetitive, right? You want to be careful not to keep telling the same story over and over again without allowing enough difference. I mean, there's one thing to have like recurring themes. I mean, that's actually interesting and a good approach. But you don't want to just keep telling the same story. Ideally, you want every generation to feel different from the one that came before. And that could be in a way that sort of mirrors, you know, the new generation rejecting the older generation's value systems. So like in Pendragon, you might have the newer generation being all like, yeah, King Arthur, yeah, chivalry. The way that mom and dad lived was, you know, total Dark Ages stuff. I'm into like, you know, this new way of living, you know. Or it could be like later on in the campaign chronology, it could be like things aren't as good as they used to be. Mom and dad had it easy. Now it's all falling apart. Use the framework to really explore those differences, I think, and just avoid the pitfall of just repeating yourself.
I'll pull it back now slightly to some specific examples. And the first specific example I want to talk about is in the context of Pendragon. Pendragon is obviously a game, and I think there are a lot of settings and systems like this that have rules in the world that define kind of the logic of how Lineage play works in terms of, you know, firstborn children or, you know, dynamics in family, number of kids, and even the gender of children can play a big part. And obviously Pendragon has a lot of mechanics so that you can play the knight you want to play no matter what. But is there any sort of insight you can give onto that dynamic on how players and GMs can make the structure of families work for them? Or is there any considerations that they should have coming into building the families that will emerge?
So yeah, I mean, in Pendragon specifically, there is a lot of support for that, as you say, not just mechanically, but in terms of like the materials that are in the books, talking about things like inheritance laws. If you're the firstborn, if you're the heir, the designated heir, you're going to get all the good stuff. And then if you're like kid number 5, it's like, you know, well, I don't know, like we'll give you what we can, but we don't have much left, you know. So that in and of itself obviously, you know, can create some interesting stories. Generally speaking, one thing I haven't really, I sort of referenced earlier is that, you know, another way you can do a Lineage campaign is to have 2 separate campaigns, right? So like if you're doing that Call of Cthulhu idea where it's like you have your 1920s investigators and you have your modern day investigators, it's really going to be highly dependent on how the setting treats things like inheritance or how it treats things like family expectations. You know, back to Pendragon, you are encouraged to develop something of a family tree, at least to have an idea of like, well, you know, how many cousins do we have? How many other, you know, knights are in the family? And that actually creates a nice little pool to draw from because, you know, combat in Pendragon can be deadly. And sometimes things happen and your knight, you know, buys the farm a little earlier than you anticipated and your kid is still 5 years old. So what are you going to do? Well, here comes your cousin, you know, he's going to step in or whatever, you know, brother-in-law, sister-in-law, whoever it may be.
Drawing a little further along that, you mentioned earlier that in Lineage play, you don't actually have to be playing biological children, adopted children, or even, you know, mentorship relationships, or even just, you know, a heritage of experience sounds like it's possible. Can you talk to some of the ways that can be best built and implemented in a campaign?
In a setting like Pendragon, where you have very legal requirements for like, you know, who is counted as a member of a family or whatnot, you can absolutely have a situation where somebody legally adopts another, you know, another person's kid, or even just like a younger companion who doesn't maybe, you know, have a lot of resources. Maybe they came from an extremely poor background, and so you're going to bring them into your family. But also, and this goes for Pendragon, but it goes for a lot of other settings as well, organizations are a great way to do that. So, for example, in Pendragon, you have the Daughters of Boudica, who are the all-woman knight, organization, order. And they're certainly allowed to go off and get married and have kids, and you could have that. Or you can just have like, hey, I'm just going to play successive generations of this order who are mentored by the older characters as they come up. There's a tradition, and there's, certain like values that get passed down. And I guess that's like sort of really where it comes in. It's like who's inheriting the values that are, being established by this lineage. That's what it really comes down to.
Hearing about this stuff, which for want of a better word, I always think of as high concept role playing, just using cool things that are so difficult to make emerge in other storytelling formats. I love hearing about it. And thanks for giving us all this insight. Is there anything I didn't ask you? Is there any last points you'd like to make? Anything I forgot to bring up?
I don't think so. I would just, repeat what I said at the top, which is that I think everyone should give this a try at some point, if possible, and you don't even necessarily have to invest 1.5 to 3 years of your life to do this. You can, as long as you're doing enough time jumps, you can do this in a much shorter span of time. And just sort of, don't be afraid to like jump ahead 20 years even, if you really want to just move things along, and you can do that in Pendragon, you can do that with any system. So, that would be my advice, is just, give it a shot if you can.